Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the second episode of Nima Voices, a virtual interview series. My name is Naomi Hirahara, and I'm a social historian as well as a mystery writer. Several of my web serials, are actually on Discover Nikkei. So before we start the program, I wanted to briefly introduce what is Discover Nikkei and what is the Nima Voices series. So Discover Nikkei is the Japanese American National Museum's international community-based web project, and it has major funding from the Nippon Foundation since 2005. And the site is in 4 languages, so English, Japanese, Spanish, and Portuguese. And it shares unique stories from around the world, from the US to Peru, Brazil, Canada, Argentina, Mexico, and other countries around the world. And news stories are published daily, so check the Discover Nikkei website every day, okay? So what's a NEMA? So NEMA are members of we are the Discover Nikkei online community, and you can be a NEMA too. We're from all over the world, and we bring a unique experiences and perspectives to the site, which is a rich archive of stories. And Nima Voices is an interview series where we lift up our fellow Nima through brief but enlightening interviews. So in this second episode, I will be interviewing Erik Matsunaga, and I'm so happy to be and pleased to be doing this. Erik has been such an important source of information for actually my next mystery that's coming out in August called Clark and Division. And Erik's investigation into the history of Chicago's Japanese American community have been featured by JANM, the Alphawood Gallery, WBEZ Radio, and the Newberry Library. Who was born in Chicagoland. He's a descendant of World War II era Nikkei resettlers from California, and he curates Windy City Nikkei on Instagram, and that's bite-sized glimpses of Japanese American Chicago. So if you're interested in Nikkei in Chicago, definitely check out his Instagram site. After my conversation with Erik, we'll ask him some of your questions. So use the YouTube chat feature. You have to be logged into YouTube to use it. And I'll get to a few of them at the end of our conversation. We will share links to the articles we refer to in the YouTube chat, as well as the video description. And so, Erik, how are you doing?
Good. Thanks, Naomi. Thank you, Vicky. Thank you, Joy. Thank you, Yoko, for having me here. Discover Nikkei.
So, you've written about your family in Discover Nikkei. So can you share some of I think you have a few photos of your family. I know it's, very expansive on both sides, but just give us a little snapshot.
Well, first of all, happy birthday to my grandmother. December 15th is her birthday. She passed in 2011 at 92 years old. So she had a great life. She'd have been, 102 this year. But anyway, my family came here with the early migration of Japanese immigrants to do farming work, initially in Hawaii, and then came to the mainland. So my great-grandfathers, as you probably tell, and you already know, but I'm of multiracial heritage. So on my father's side, they came from Japan. On my mother's side, she's the child of German immigrants. On my paternal side, the family came over, my great-grandfathers, initially in 1904 and 1906. And then they worked the land for a while, saved some money, and they ordered their wives from Japan. They had picture brides. So they wrote back with younger pictures of themselves and had a go-between from their villages, matched them up. And then my great-grandmothers came over. So my both of my grandparents on my father's side grew up in Central Cal in the Fresno area. And pre-war, my grandfather migrated down to Los Angeles and was living in the Little Tokyo area.
And I understand he had a residential hotel.
So both of my grandparents grew up in agriculture. They farmed raisins just outside of Fresno in Fowler and Del Rey. When my grandfather went down to Los Angeles, his mother had moved down there. His father had passed away. So his mother went down to LA and she met some guy. She actually remarried, but he was in the hotel business. So he ran a residential hotel in Little Tokyo. It's outside of Little Tokyo now, but at that time would have been in J-Town at 4th and Central. And my grandfather lived there, and he worked for an Issei produce man at a place called 3 Star Produce down in Huntington Park.
I'm familiar with that. I've heard it before.
Are you?
Yeah, I think the Hasuike family was connected to that.
Sounds familiar.
So how did you get to Chicago? How did that all happen?
So my grandparents were incarcerated together at Gila River. They got married in Gila River. They had grown up with each other. They knew each other from Fowler, Del Rey area. And they ended up getting work release. Actually, my grandfather, having grown up in agriculture, he got actually education release to go to St. Paul, Minnesota. And in St. Paul, he went to welding school. So they spent 9 months in camp, went to St. Paul in 1943. And by 1945, they had migrated down to Chicago. He had finished his welding course. And jobs were just aplenty in Chicago at that time for industry.
Can you show us a couple of your family photos, and then let's go into Chicago after that?
Sure. So this first one is my grandmother. Well, maybe the first one is, there's my grandmother. That's at 2138 North Halstead, and today it's the Lincoln Park neighborhood. And this was the second place they lived after Clark and Division. This is a 1949 picture. So she would have been 30 or 20, what? My math is bad. Well, 1918 and 1949.
I love that photo. I mean, it's very, I read some of your pieces. I think this was Crooks and Crannies, or Nooks and Crannies.
Nooks and Crannies, yeah.
Essay, and her love for Thomas's English muffins.
Yeah, boy, were they a treat. That's what she said. But, and yeah, if she had enough, she would get that and put butter on it.
You know, in that particular piece, you also went to San Francisco, but you talk about noir, and this is kind of like a noir. I mean, I'm a mystery writer, so it gives off a noir kind of vibe to me, this particular photo.
Yeah, kind of does.
How about the next photo that you had?
The next photo is my grandmother's family. And this is in Fowler, California, about 15 miles southeast of Fresno. And my grandmother is in the back row, second from the left, behind her mother, who's in the center wearing the hat. And this was their family. I imagine that my great-grandfather took the photo since he's not in it, and he would have been around at that time. So this is the 1930s, before the war.
You know, one thing about your background, Erik, and you write about this, is that there's so much diaspora. You know, LA, San Francisco, you've lived in Los Angeles yourself, you know, and you mentioned Hawaii before, and then Chicago, which is your passion. Can you show us and I know you're like this master map builder. Can you just show us the different neighborhoods that Japanese Americans lived in Chicago historically?
Yeah, so historically, there were, so far I've been mapping 4 different neighborhoods. Initially, they came to the Clark and Division neighborhood, and the Oakland and Kenwood neighborhood on the south side. So they were on the near north and the south side. And this was right after camp from about 1943, 1944 up until I'd say around the early 60s. Clark and Division was probably like mid to late 60s. They tore it down for some condominiums. A lot of them then migrated up to the Lakeview area and also uptown in Edgewater. Actually, prior to 1980, it was all uptown. A lot of people settled up there too from the 40s and onwards, but there wasn't, although you can see quite a few things in uptown and Edgewater, that's really, I'd say, I think that's a 30-year spread, and they didn't have a real concentration of business, more residential up there. Lakeview had from probably about the late 1950s, early 1960s through the 1990s, and continuing today a little bit. There's a couple leftover businesses, but that was pretty heavily Japanese American, and probably aside from Clark and Division, what anybody might refer to or remember as, what would have been Chicago's Japantown neighborhood. Now, Chicago never had an official Japantown neighborhood. Unfortunately, I think with no designation of geography, and then just with the disbursement of the community, and nobody really felt like hanging around there. And certainly, the Sansei generation, they weren't taking over the businesses because they were getting educations and moving on to bigger and better things, quote unquote. But there are a couple things left in Lakeview. There's a Matsuya restaurant. There's a Japanese culture center. Actually, I'm representing my Nisei Lounge hoodie right now.
Tell us about Nisei Lounge.
You have, yeah. Nisei Lounge started in the Clark and Division neighborhood in right around 1944, 45, and it was originally called Nisei Tavern and Liquor Store. And it was opened by a gentleman named Hiroto Hirabayashi, and his nickname was Conch. And I don't know why, but a lot of these Nisei had these really cool nicknames. He had it for a while, then he sold it to his brother, and his brother's name was Kazuo Hirabayashi, and his nickname was Zolk. And Zolk moved Nisei Tavern from Clark and Division when everybody started moving about 3 miles north on Clark Street. So he moved it up to where it is presently at Sheffield and Clark at the corner of Newport, and he renamed it Nisei Lounge. He passed in
to where the Chicago Cubs plays, right? Wrigleyville.
That's right. Yeah, it's 2 blocks south of Wrigley Field, and it's the last dive bar around there. I mean, there used to be like a lot of neighborhood bars. It was a kind of a blue collar neighborhood, and then gentrification came through, and now it's all sports bars and a lot of just big crowds of young people. And then you have Nisei Lounge there, which is still like kind of old and soulful, and it's gone through a number of owners. The current owners today really respect and celebrate its provenance. They host community events there for the Japanese American community, have guest bartenders and things like that for various fundraisers, and they've been a real support to the community. And I should plug that they've been having a difficult time, I think, as many of these establishments have through the pandemic. And so they've started a Shopify account. So anybody looking up, Google Nisei Lounge Shopify, and you can find things like these hoodies and T-shirts and cozies, and
what a great
selling
gift.
them online.
I got to order some. So I just want to remind people that you could be putting your questions in the chat. And Joy, we can start fielding some of these questions. But Erik, why are you doing this? Why are you documenting these stories from Chicago?
Well, the impetus was my wife had gone out of town when my little girls were toddlers, and they were taking a nap. And I was thinking about how my grandmother held all the stories in our family for at least, that side of the family. And it was all oral. I had oral history. I'd sit at the kitchen table with her and she'd drink coffee and smoke cigarettes and cook some food and feed the dog and feed the birds and feed the cat. And in the meantime, just tell these stories. And she would start in one place and then kind of go all around. She grew up as a farmer. Farmers like to talk. And there were some times where I thought she just lost her mind. She'd be going on about all these different things. And at the end, if I sat there long enough, she'd reconnect everything and go, wow, that's a great story. So I'm sitting there and my girls are taking a nap and my wife, Christine, she's at work. And I was like, man, I got to put some of these stories down. So I was actually looking online and I was on Japantown Atlas. I don't know if you've ever seen that Japantown Atlas website.
Ben Peace.
And, Ben Peace, yeah, he never met the gentleman, but he put up some phenomenal maps based on the Sanborn insurance maps.
Mm-hmm.
And so I pulled up Fresno because that's where my family was from. And I had actually discussed the Fresno map with my grandparents previously, and they kind of argued about what was where. And I'm like, well, you argue about it, but it's all right here on the map, 1940. My grandmother worked there. My grandfather knew the area really well. But anyway, so what I first did was I took that map and I went onto Google Maps. This is like 2007, 2008. And I went on Google Maps Street View, and I just started taking Street View, screenshots of any business that was still around there. And I started writing up little things about these different addresses and anything that my grandparents might have told me. And I thought, well, I'm going to pass this on to my kids. And then I thought, well, there's no maps on Chicago. Maybe I'll make my own maps for Chicago. And then I kind of fell down a rabbit hole in there. And both of my parents grew up in Lakeview. So I started off with Lakeview.
When I was in Chicago, you were kind enough to give me a walking tour of the Clark and Division area. And, there's not that much remaining, but I kind of like the visceral experience of being in the region,
Yeah.
and there are a few buildings here and there, but it's fascinating to me that there seems to be so much interest in Chicago and Japanese Americans. And I think some of it was the exhibition at the Alpha Wood Gallery that was, 3 years ago. And
then they came for me.
Yes. And when and a lot of the images were very familiar to me because they were Dorothea Lange, they're Toyo Miyatake. I think for us on California, they're very familiar images. But what I thought was interesting was the response for people from Chicago who were not Japanese American. They were kind of shocked and surprised, like, oh my, it was like a revelation to some of these people who that I saw in the audience. So I think what you're doing is super important, and it's kind of like this. So many. It was like 20,000 Japanese Americans, right, had lived in Chicago at some time. So many people have, somebody in their family who lived in Chicago, and some of it's very nostalgic. But I think some things were very difficult that maybe, were not expressed. But yeah. So did you want to comment? Why are people talking about Chicago so much right now?
Well, I think it was just kind of a big splash in history. It wasn't something that lasted a really long time, unless you consider, people like me that are still here. But from going from about 400 people in 1941 to about 20,000 in 1945, that's a big rock to throw in there. I mean, it's just caused some big ripples. And I think Chicago is just something completely different from where most people had come from on the West Coast. There were a lot of people from rural areas, and this was their first experience of the big city. Their first time, I've talked to people that Nisei that were like, wow, that was the first time we lived in an apartment, and I didn't like it. And there was no space. There was nothing around. So it was a real big change, I think, for everybody, number one. I think number two, like with my grandmother, for instance, she loved the fact that she could get a job essentially anywhere. She could ride the bus and go into any neighborhood. And it was such a welcoming society for her. So, when she turned 18, she got off of the family farm and went to beauty school in San Francisco. And the only place that she could find housing was in the Japanese district. She finished beauty school. She went back home. The only place she could find to get a salon job was in the Japanese district. And she said, well, it's like they don't want us anywhere else, but then they send us off because they say we're too clannish and we stick to our own, but we can't go anywhere. So I think that a lot of people that came here felt kind of a freedom, like a splash of freedom. Not only they got out of camp and ended up here and they can move around, but it was easier to find jobs outside of the community, maybe easier to be themselves. I think a lot of Nisei too, if they were establishing themselves, and I've talked to, a couple people here and there that felt like there was a little bit of freedom. It was the first time they were not under the thumb of the Issei, and they actually had a voice. I think when you're young, that kind of thing sticks with you no matter where you go. You go back to California, you move somewhere else in the country, even if you stay in Chicago, I think that kind of thing sticks with you. And I think it sticks with the people that never had a community like that, just kind of come in and, invade the space, so to speak. So people, even non-Japanese Americans, these people come in and are like, where did they all come from all of a sudden? And I think that.
I have a few questions for you, and we'll go real fast. One is from Vince Schrottweiler. He says, Erik's accent is making me miss my hometown.
I don't have an accent. All you guys have accents.
It seems like there has been a real Chicago Nikkei renaissance in the past decade or so. Well, we kind of, discussed that right now. Why do you think that is? So
right.
I think we covered that. And then Corey Shiozaki asks, okay, so this is going to test your know-how of Chicago. I was born on the north side at Edgewater Beach Hospital. When I was about 5 years old, and Corey's much older than you, Erik, there was the Edgewater Hotel. What happened to the hotel? Have you heard of it?
The Edgewater Hotel is still there. It's pink. It's on the corner of Broadway and Lakeshore Drive.
Awesome.
Yep, it's still there.
You are awesome. Okay. He also asked, do you say pop instead of soda?
Yes. And that is a point of contention in our house because my wife, Christine, is from Los Angeles and she says soda.
And this question from Walter Nishinaka, I know the answer. Cubs or Dodgers?
Cubs or Dodgers?
I think you have another team in mind. Yeah. Say it again.
White Sox.
Yeah, White Sox. Okay. And Vince also asks, how has the response to your work been from Nikkei outside Chicago, making connections to their family past?
Oh, it's been surprisingly good, or maybe not so surprisingly, but it's been really good. I've made a lot of really nice connections with people who've read the articles on Discover Nikkei and were really interested in telling their stories. And I think that's what I really wanted to put out with these maps and all these other stories, is to collect more, just to have people talk and reminisce. And yeah, that's been great. If I could throw in one thing, I know you talked about Nima, but for people, even maybe some of my family members that are not Japanese American, I don't think we really talked about what Nikkei means.
So what is Nikkei?
So Nikkei is, and you can correct me if my answer is a little bit off, but Nikkei is a descendant of a Japan. It's either a Japanese immigrant or their descendants, people that don't live in Japan, maybe generations non-Japanese citizens, but are of Japanese heritage living in the diaspora.
Yeah, it's of Japanese descent. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so some rapid fire questions. Who is your Nikkei hero? Don't
I want
think
to
about
keep
it.
my parents, both of my parents, including my German mother, who has had to put up with my Sansei father for 50 years. So she's an honorary Nikkei.
What is your favorite Japanese Nikkei food of Chicago?
Of Chicago, I think we need to talk about the Akutagawa.
Can you
From
show it on our screen?
Yeah, homegrown Chicago food, the Akutagawa at the old Hamburger King, which today is Rice and Bread, and it's 2 doors down from Nisei Lounge. It's still there. You can see there, Naomi and I shared a meal together. It was named after a Nisei named George Akutagawa, who this was just a short order counter, and he said, I want this thing, and just put some of this, some of that, and some of the other in there, and then they ended up just putting it on the menu. And it's been there ever since, probably since the 50s.
I would like to have some right now. Okay, what is the Japanese value that has most influenced you?
I want to say I like Nana Korobia Oki. That seven times down, 8 times up.
Hi, yes. Sounds good. We need that right now for sure. What do you like most about Discover Nikkei?
I like, this is a weird thing, aside from your stories, of course, all the serials that you put out. I like reading things in other languages. So I have a modicum of Spanish knowledge. So when I like to read about like Japanese Peruvians in Spanish, and it kind of helps me to read it because I understand the context. So the context of what I'm reading helps me to understand the language a little bit better. And even Portuguese, reading about Japanese Brazilians, or as you mentioned before, the Argentinians too, Chileans, but South America is very interesting to me, as well as Canada and everywhere else that the Japanese settle.
So on right now, one of the viewers is named Sandy Dolan. Do you know who she is? She says that so she's saying the Edgewater Hotel was demolished, and the
really?
building is the Edgewater Apartments, but now condos.
Okay.
So you look into that. Okay?
Corrected. I stand corrected.
But thanks everybody for coming, and check out Erik. Erik, you have enough material on Discover Nikkei for a book, and anybody who is curious about Chicago should check that out. And I'm also, in addition to my books, I'm writing the serials for Discover Nikkei, and right now it's 10 days of cleanup. It's kind of a Marie Kondo not type of serial that you can read right now. And then the next episode of Nima Voices is on Tuesday, March 2nd, and it's hosted by Justin Kawaguchi. And the featured Nima is Tamiko Nimura. So yay, Tamiko's a wonderful historian about the Pacific Northwest, and she has a graphic novel that's coming out. So any last words, Erik, to our audience here?
Yeah, you mentioned Tamiko. She actually, if you look up the Nihon Machi app, she's done a map of her own of the historic Tacoma Japantown. It's great. It's a walking tour map you can get on your iPhone. Can't wait for that one. Can't wait for her interview.
It's wonderful that, all these regions have their resident expert. And Erik, you are just a fount of so much great information. And if people want to reach you, what's the best way to do that? Is it through Windy City Nikkei, or what would you?
Yeah. Instagram, Windy City Nikkei.
Yeah. So just DM him there and share your stories. And yeah, so anyway, thank you so much, Erik. I can't wait to see you in person and your family. And thanks to all for tuning in. So,
Thank you all. And I can't wait to read Clark and Division. Can't wait for it to come out.
yeah. Okay. Good night, everybody.